Greetings. This is so exciting. I welcome you wholeheartedly. There's been a lot of incredible energy that has gone into creating our very, very first live broadcast. And the fact that everything came together, having our broadcasters, our broadcast trainer, uh, all last weekend, and it went really well, and having the opportunity to be with everyone on the full moon of the Buddha's birthday, Enlightenment Day, and Day of Departure, according to the Tibetan tradition. And that is called Sagadawa. In other Buddhist traditions, this is celebrated on other days, the full moon in May, and for some cultures, April, and even some cultures, December. But we have the great opportunity to come together at this full moon in this celebration in what is called praises. Praises is something that I learned a little bit later in my Buddhist training, where what we praise is what's important, is what's noble, and also is our own aspiration. So this is a time of really great praise and also of great gratitude. I am aware, very aware, that at this time, it's a troubled time. It's a troubled time in our culture. It's a troubled time globally. And many of us have been through troubled times before. And it's always difficult how to respond, what to do. However, we are doing and we are coming together. This evening, I am going to really dovetail into our current circumstance, a time where, as a culture, as a country, something very horrific happened, is that a man was murdered, and we all saw it, and we all saw that it was unjust, that it was cruel, that it was unthinkable. And I personally want to acknowledge that Samden Ling, everyone engaged and who knows, is in solidarity with justice, with Black Lives Matter, with everyone being a full human being and having the right to breathe, the right to drink pure water, and having human rights, and that nature herself is something to be protected. And so it's with that spirit that we come together with incredible grace. Whenever there's group karma, such as now, there is also individual karma. And right now, our individual karma is that we have the freedom, we have the human possibility of listening, of speaking freely, and of celebrating. And this evening, we're celebrating the Buddha's enlightenment. And what does that really mean? And who was the Buddha? Many of us have studied Buddhism for a very long time. Sometimes we connect to the Buddha, sometimes maybe not. But the Buddha, the most important thing, is someone who was a human being, who, as he sat under the Bodhi tree, was attacked, whether it was a real attack, an internal attack, whatever. But he was attacked by what's called Mara. And Mara is greed, hatred, delusion, fear. And the Buddha, sitting under the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya, India, which is north central India, touched the earth to witness all that he had done to break free of greed, hatred, delusion, and fear. And as we are seeing now, very vividly, that is a really, really hard thing to do. And coming into what's called full awakening, which is our potential. All of us. We all have that same potential. I hark back to my own personal story because I think that I am such an unlikely person to have myself sat under the Bodhi tree. I was born in a rural county, sparsely populated, in North Carolina during the pandemic of polio. And my grandparents built a house for me and our family in South Carolina by the ocean because they believed that salt water prevented polio. And so that's the steps that they took. At the same time, in the small town that we lived in, my grandfather and grandmother had a store, and it was the main, in quotes, department store in this very tiny town that had one main street and was unpaved. In the town was segregation. I was born before there was the civil rights movement, and the town had 3,000 people and 3 schools, one for white people, one for African American people, and one for Native American people. And the one for the African American people, was one of the Rosenwald schools, if you know that history. My grandmother wanted my mother to go beyond living in the South, and she sent her to Ohio to go to college. And that's where my mother met my father, at Ohio State. So although I was born in the South, I was raised in Cincinnati, Ohio, in a very conventional way. I was a cheerleader. I had a lot of friends. I went to an integrated public school. And then during vacations, we got in the car and we drove across the Ohio River from Cincinnati into Kentucky, Tennessee, and down to the Carolinas, where the experience of driving through the segregated South was really horrific. There were segregated bathrooms. We drove with the woman who worked in our home, who was black, and she could not come into the restaurants. She could not stay at the hotels. And we drove into what was called shanty towns so that she could find a place to sleep and have a hot meal. So these were the conditions that I witnessed as a child and as a teenager. The civil rights happened when I was approximately 16, and the house that was built for me in South Carolina was sold. So growing up in Ohio in a very conventional way, I thought there must be more. And I had an aunt come up to me when I was 16, and she said, "Oh, darling, just love these times because these are the best times of your life." And I thought to myself, that really can't be true. And so I loved to travel, and I went to college at Ohio State University, and I took a class in Asian Studies. And then when I graduated, my family gave me a trip to Europe. And on that trip to Europe, I wound up in Istanbul, Turkey. And that was in 1969. And in 1969, I was at a place across from Hagia Sophia, which was a very beautiful, large mosque. And the place was called the Pudding Shop. And the Pudding Shop was where a lot of the beatniks and the hippies would all go, and there was no way to be in communication except for a bulletin board. And there was a bulletin board in the Pudding Shop, and you could put up signs, and the signs would say, "Want travel partners to go overland to India. And I had just graduated from Ohio State, and I was on what was supposed to be a European tour to learn about European culture and art. And I was in Istanbul, Turkey, staring at the bulletin board in the pudding shop. So I looked at this bulletin board and I said, I will return here and I will go. And so I came back to the United States and went to graduate school and became a school teacher and was one of the people trained very early on in developmental reading. And so I understood that many young people had learning disabilities, and so I tried to help. But at the same time, I saw that the help wasn't holistic enough, and that something else needed to be done. And I decided this would be the time, after a year of teaching, that I would go around the world and I would go back to the pudding shop. And so I went back to the pudding shop and I found travel partners to go to Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and into India. However, this was 1971, and when we got to the border of Turkey and Iran, my travel partners were asked to get off the bus in the middle of the night because they had long hair, and the Shah of Iran was giving a party in Shiraz, and the borders were heavily monitored. I was allowed to stay on the bus alone, and I went into Tehran on this bus, where I found out that the people were incredibly hospitable. And so I was fed lovely little sweets all night. And then when I got off the bus, I made one phone call. My uncle, who put me on the plane in JFK in New York, said to me, he said, I really don't know very many people in that part of the world, but he was a vice principal and he had had 2 interns, and one was from Tehran and one was living in India. And so I made the phone call in Tehran, and this lovely woman picked me up and hosted me in their family home for several days, and was very frightened for me because they then drove me to the bus station to take the bus, again alone, to Afghanistan, where I went to Kabul, Herat, names that we hear now, and then on to Pakistan, to the Indian border. And when I was at the Indian border, there was no one. And then I saw a man and his son walk up, and they were waiting with me at the border. And we began to talk, and I asked why they were waiting, and they said they had a van. So I thought, that would be nice. And so then I asked them their names, and it turns out that this gentleman was the second name that my cousin had given me. And so they took me to New Delhi, to Mrs. Kalako's, and somebody was asking me the other day about early days, like, did I know Ram Dass? Did I ever hear of a book called the Be Here Now book? And the answer is yes. And I also met the guru from the Be Here Now book. However, it wasn't what I was particularly looking for in the beginning. In the beginning, what I was looking for, and why I talk about aspiration a lot, is that my aspiration was to learn experientially. And learning experientially for me was quite different than learning intellectually, which I had done going to college and teaching school. And I wanted to put myself in different situations where I would learn from different cultures by living in them. And so then when I got to India, another aspiration was that when I was in graduate school, someone gave me a postcard, and the postcard said, send 50 cents and get your cookbook. And I thought I was ordering a vegetarian cookbook, but instead a box came in the mail, and in the box were different chapters and posters, which would become the Be Here Now book. And I didn't know what to do with it, so I put it up in my closet. But somebody came and stayed at our house, and who knows why, went into my closet and pulled down this box. And he said, "Do you know what this is?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, this is the Be Here Now book." And so we stayed up all night, and someone read me the Be Here Now book. So I had the concept. And then when I was in India, I had the good fortune to go trekking in the Himalayas. And I went up to, the furthest one could go at that time was Jomson, so toward Annapurna. And I lived in Swayambhu, near Kathmandu. And we could go no further because Mustang and all of those places were blocked because there was still fighting in 1971. And but when I went on my trek, I saw Tibetan people, and they were coming out of Tibet, and they were very, very poor, but they smiled. And I knew the stories, and I thought, wow, people can smile in the midst of tragedy. And of course, I had read books on the Holocaust, and I had gone to many memorials, but it was never told to me that in the midst of tragedy, one could uphold something different. So the smiles were, for me, a great transmission. And then later, when I went up to Dharamsala to meet His Holiness the Dalai Lama, I was on a bus, and it was just me. I was the only Caucasian person, the only woman. And there were some Tibetans sitting across from me, and an old beggar got on the bus, and he was begging. And I watched these people, very poor, whose job it was to carry rocks on their backs to build roads, pull out 1 rupee and to give it. And I thought, that is such an act of generosity, maybe like I'd never seen before. So I saw what was seemingly small actions inspire. And while I was trekking in the Himalayas, my mind kept wandering. And I thought, I want to have that knowledge that's in the Be Here Now book. I want to know how to be in the present moment when I look up at Annapurna. I want to know how to be in the present moment when I'm seeing these beautiful sights, when I am walking, when I am trekking. And so that became a goal. I wanted that. And when I came back from my trek, I went to a place that's not there anymore called the Pie and Chai Shop. And as travelers do, I was talking to other travelers, and they said, "Well, where have you been?" And I said, "Well, I've been to the Taj Mahal, and I've been to the Ganges River, and I've been to Ellora and Ajanta Caves, and I've been living here in Swayambhu." And they said, "Oh, well, it sounds like you should be meditating." And I said, "Oh, well, I probably should be meditating." And so they said, "Well, there's going to be a meditation retreat that starts January 19th, and it's in Bodh Gaya." So I went to visit a friend in the Peace Corps, and then I walked out of southern Nepal into northern India and took a train to Gaya, and then took a pony cart to Bodh Gaya. And it was days before the retreat was beginning. And so it was a very quiet village at that time. There were many trees, there were some elephants. And so I would walk every day to the Bodhi tree, and I would sit under the Bodhi tree. And I didn't know very much. I had done some transcendental meditation, some yoga, but I didn't know Buddhism. and I didn't know very much about where I was. So I was sitting under the Bodhi tree, and at one point it was hard to know whether it was the light shining through the leaves, the pipal leaves, but it seemed to be bright. It seemed as though I was sitting under a very bright tree. And later, when I heard the story that the Buddha, to call witness, touched the earth at that site and came into full awakening, I understood a little bit more about the power of such a place. Some of us last year went to Lumbini, where the Buddha was born, on pilgrimage, and felt the power of that place. And so the earth itself has held these very powerful places, which is why we must protect the earth. It's been our home. Then, after sitting under the Bodhi tree, I walked down the road, which at that time was a tree-lined road, to the Burmese Buddhist Vihara. And again, I did not know anyone there. I just took the message of the woman from the pie and chai shop that I should be meditating, and this was the place. And it was because the teacher spoke English. So I walked through a wrought iron gate with Burmese writing, and just as I walked in, I saw somebody I did know from Kathmandu. And so I was really excited to see somebody I knew, and I said, this is my first retreat. It's going to be 10 days. What should I do? And he said, what you should do is follow everything the teacher says, all of the guidance, and don't pay attention to anyone else. Because everyone here has been everywhere. They have met every guru, they have gone to every yoga ashram, and you will hear many, many stories. Only pay attention to what the teacher says. And so I did. And what the first thing the teacher said was, this is how to be in the present moment. And I thought, oh my goodness. And the practice was called vipassana, means to see things clearly. Many of the methods is what we now know as mindfulness. And so when I stepped through the wrought iron gates of the Burmese Buddhist Vihara, I began my journey into the learning of vipassana, of mindfulness. And the first retreat was 10 days, and we kept noble silence, although people would whisper. And then at the end of the retreat, I thought, this is exactly what the students who I was teaching developmental reading to would need, to know and to learn how to be in the present moment. And at the same time, I thought, I don't know if this is something I would do, because the teacher, his name was Gonpa, said in order to do this practice, one needs to practice an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening. And I thought, I really don't know if I would do that. And he was a very strong person. He himself had his business nationalized in Burma, and he had to leave the country. And he left without his business and without very much, to the point that when he was leaving Burma, crossing into India, the Burmese said to him, "Are you taking any jewels?" And his response was, "None that you can see." And what he was taking was the triple gem of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So this was a very strong person, and it was a very strong teacher. So my first teacher was Goenka, and I felt a responsibility to go into him and to tell him that this was a very valuable retreat, and I had learned a lot, and I understood why my students couldn't learn, but I would never do this again. So he looked at me and he said, "Some people don't." And then I left, and I got on a train, and the train did not hook up to the full train for 12 to 24 hours, and I was on the train with many of the people from the retreat, and they were meditating an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening. And so I began meditating an hour in the morning and the hour in the evening. And then I went to New Delhi, and I stayed with people who were meditating an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening. And I thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to go to Goa. I'm going to the beach. I need to leave. So I went to Goa, and I met people who were meditating an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening. And then they were going back to the next retreat. And I went back to the next retreat. And myself and one other woman were the only people who had ever done a retreat. And so I was put in the front row as an old student. And the teacher, of course, looked at me because I had just told him I would never do this again. And so then at that point, I did another 10-day silent retreat, back-to-back 1-hour meditations. And then I left India, and I went to Thailand, and then Hong Kong, and then Japan. And when I was in Japan, what happened was that I had a choice to make. I had been traveling for a year, and I could either go back and continue to teach school, or I had seen that people stayed in India and they learned more meditation. I really didn't know what I was going to do, and then I was taken to a birthday party, my 24th birthday party, on top of one of the hotels in Tokyo where you can see out of the window. It slowly moves 360 degrees. And I realized I had done everything I wanted to do as a person. And I didn't know what else there was to do. And within a few days, I had an experience that I can only call something that was given to me by angels, is that I had a visceral experience that I would die. And I was very healthy, but I was shaking. I was beside myself because I realized that I, as a person, would die. And I didn't know what to do. I meditated, I took a walk, and finally there was a book on a common bookshelf, and it was Krishnamurti, and it was called Freedom from the Known, and it was the unknown. The unknown was the answer. And I made my decision to go back to India, and that I would meditate forever, because I didn't know how to die. But then I said to myself, but first I'm going to meet the Dalai Lama. So I traveled back to Dharamsala and spent a week there. And it was very early days. I went every day to sit in the Dalai Lama's temple. He had afternoon sessions. It would be myself and one other person. And then I went back and I walked into the Burmese Vihara in Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha was enlightened. And those days you wrote a little sentence about why you were there. And I said, I am here to learn how to die, and I will meditate for as long as that takes. And so I began a year retreat. And first it was 10 days, another 10 days, 30 days, and then at the end of that time, Goenka had invited some people to do a self-retreat, which was his annual retreat, where there would be no teacher and you would meditate alone. So I was given, the first year I was invited twice. The first year I was given this little area on the floor and a mosquito net, and there's one person next to me, and her name was Sharon. And so Sharon and I would not talk and sit up all night and meditate. And then I was given a little hut to meditate in, and the person in the next hut was Joseph. And so they became friends. We all became friends. And then Goenka said, now everyone needs to learn how to meditate on their own with no teacher and to do self-retreat. And we moved up to Dalhousie and rented houses in a hill station and did self-retreat, which is where I learned how to really take ownership of my own practice. And then when that was almost complete, someone came by, another meditation person, and she wanted to go to Darjeeling and wanted to know if I would like to come with her. And at first I didn't know what to do. Should I stay and meditate for the rest of the summer, or should I travel all the way across India and to go to Darjeeling? And so I asked Sharon, I said, what do you think I should do? And she said, I think you need to go to Darjeeling, because if you don't, you'll always regret it. So I went with this friend to Darjeeling, and we meditated all morning, and then we met very great teachers who lived in Darjeeling. And the first teacher that I met, his name was Dujam Rinpoche. And we went to meet Dujam Rinpoche and spent the afternoon there. And then at the end of his teaching, he went into his trunk, or he had somebody go into his trunk and pull out a picture, and he signed it and he gave it to me. And I really didn't understand the picture, because it wasn't a picture of him, and it wasn't a picture of anyone that I knew. And I took it because I was very happy that someone gave me a gift, but I had no idea why. It would be years later that I found out that the picture was of the great saint Padmasambhava, who brought Buddhism from the Swat Valley in Pakistan into India, and is known as having been born in a lotus, and taught the practices that now I do and many of us do. And the next teacher I met was Chato Rinpoche, who was vegetarian, which was very different at that time, and we went on a picnic together. And on our picnic, he said, "You are Tibetan." I said, "Well, I don't know." And we ate and talked. And then the next teacher I met was Kanjo Rinpoche, who was very famous for having put together deep scriptures that we now read. And I actually asked him if I could study with him, and he said, "No, you need to go back to your teacher," which I did. And the fourth teacher I met was Kalu Rinpoche. And Kalu Rinpoche, I asked him, what kind of environment should I meditate in? And he said, away from wild animals. And there's a little story attached to that if we have time. So I met great teachers. I was able to meditate all morning and meet great teachers in the afternoon. And then my teacher Goenka came back, and he gave a retreat in Darjeeling, which I attended, and then kept going to the many retreats that he gave all over India, and then back to Bodh Gaya. And then at the end of one of the retreats, he asked me to co-manage a retreat in Rajgir. And Rajgir is another holy place of the Buddha, and so I managed his retreat in Rajgir. So then it had been 3 years being in Asia, and it was time to come home. And when I came back to the United States, I went to the first year of Naropa Institute in the summer, and there met someone who said, I am going to be selling a house in the Santa Cruz Mountains. I want you to create a meditation house. And so all of us had nowhere to live. And so this meditation house in the Santa Cruz Mountains became known as the Dharma Vihara, and we all went to live there. And from the Dharma Vihara came the idea for a larger meditation center on the East Coast known as now as the Insight Meditation Society. And it was time to move to the East Coast, and I said, I'm going to stay on the West Coast because I am learning so much from meeting different therapies and different kinds of body movements and different kind of body works. And so I stayed on the West Coast and met a teacher named Dr. Rina Sirkar, who was a disciple of Tangpulu Sayadaw. And she invited me to teach meditation with her, which is where I began. And then eventually my friends did pull me back very shortly later to the East Coast for the Insight Meditation Society, where we invited Mahasi Sayadaw from Burma to visit. And it was during his visit to the Insight Meditation Society that I was first authorized to teach in the Theravada Buddhist tradition. And Mahasi Sayadaw was very instrumental in bringing Buddhism and Buddhist practice and meditation training to lay people. And that began in 1956 in Burma. And so I was the first Western woman to be ordained at Tatanayekta, which was a meditation center where there were monastics and also lay people. And while I was there, I was a nun, and I was asked to teach the women in my dormitory, and I was, my ordination was historic, and it was in the newspapers, and it attracted hundreds of people because this was the first. When I was in Burma, I also had the opportunity to have translators and go to very small monasteries where I had taken robes as an 8-precept nun. My name was Kemasari, and I later took robes with Tangpulu Sayadaw, and my name was Kondalaketi. And then more recently, when I was asked to write for the Hidden Moon article where I spoke about Bodh Gaya, and I say this because there's the sound of K, and I was given the sound of K as names because it corresponded to being Monday born and having the tiger as my symbol. When I had these different ordinations by these Theravada monks, they were quite old. Tangpulu Sayadaw was a forest monk. He had not laid down in 40 years. And Mahasi Sayadaw was known as both a great scholar and great meditation master who created a system that is practiced to this day in Burma. So after all of this and teaching through the Insight Meditation Society, I decided to change my life. And there are many steps there that we don't have time for, but I got married and I moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and gave birth to twin daughters. And I raised my twin daughters with Buddhist principles, but not necessarily to become Buddhist. But I raised them with the same kind of generosity that I saw on the bus with the poor Tibetan woman giving the beggar money, with the smiles that I saw of people in torturous situations coming out of the mountains, and also with my own family history of how did they relate in the rural South during the time of segregation was also through generosity. They were able to give to, my grandfather called it the tab. Because of segregation, African American people could not shop except on Saturdays, and my grandfather would just say, "It's on the tab." but he never charged. And then when the civil rights happened, he was the first person to hire an African American person from his own wanting to do good. This was in a tiny town where acts of generosity could actually be dangerous. When my grandmother, who was originally from New York, moved with my grandfather to South Carolina, she gave a tip of money to a maid, and within hours there were people on her lawn protesting. So a lot of what was learned of generosity was hidden, and of course nobody knew. And then in Portland, within the last 5 years, we had the visit of Congressman Lewis, and I had the opportunity to share with him where I was born, what our family was like and how they had to function, and something which many people from rural areas understand, that racism and the dealing of racism is in our bodies. And so as soon as I started to talk, he understood. And he was doing a book signing. We were having our book signed of the march, which is for middle school people to understand the march. And he understood what my family did, and he stopped the book signing, and he stood up, and he handed me the book, and he said, "Thank your family." So a lot of what we do is unspoken, is done because it's right, and we may never be thanked, and then at an unusual time, we receive that praise. And it's back to the beginning of praises, the praises of the Buddha, the praises of just action, the praises of right speech, right action, right livelihood. These are the foundations that the Buddha did to gain the merit to become completely enlightened. And so as we are here celebrating the Buddha's birth, enlightenment, parinirvana, each of us can do those same actions of merit. Merit because it's right, merit because it's the way to share. So it was because of great merit that when I was living in Santa Fe and I felt like there was more to know, I was also teaching at a Buddhist stupa, and I had just given birth. My children were maybe a year and a half, maybe 2 years. And I found a book called Crystal and the Way of Light, and it was by Namkhai Norbu. And I read this book, and in many ways I didn't know what it said. It said names I had never heard of. It talked about people I'd never heard of. And then shortly after, someone came into the stupa and they said, "Namkhai Norbu is coming to Santa Fe. Does anyone want to take his retreat?" And I said, "Oh, I do." And so I was the first person to sign up. And a few weeks later, when I walked into the retreat, and it was the first time I left my babies, the first people that I saw were someone named Anne Klein and Harvey Aronson. And so we reconnected, and I invited them to our house where I lived with my husband at the time and my twin daughters. And then we started to connect because they were moving from California to Texas, and we lived in New Mexico. And then our family moved to Kyoto, Japan, and then to Portland, Oregon. And then when I was in Portland, a friend asked me if I would like a gift, and the gift was a retreat to Red Tara. And so I began studying with a teacher named Chaduk Tuka Rinpoche. And I had never done Tibetan practice, but I felt an affinity to him. I had heard him speak in 1982, and I walked up to him and I said, I would like to study with you. And he said, not yet. So when I first moved to Portland, I began studying with Chodok Rinpoche. And then I got a call from Anne, and she said, would you like to go to Tibet? And I thought, wow, I don't know. And then I thought, oh, but when else would I be able to go? And so she said, we're making a pilgrimage for Padmasambhava, and that was the picture I was given by Dudjom Rinpoche. And then other names I didn't recognize: Longchen Robjam, Jigme Lingpa, Yeshe Sogyal. And so we went to Tibet. And while we were crossing the Sangpo River, these people had these little buttons on, and the buttons were of a very large Tibetan. And we get across the Yarlung Sangpo River, and we go up to a place called Samye Chimpuk, where is noted for Longchenpa, and there's a very large Tibetan there who is willing to teach us. And his name was Azam Rinpoche. And he asked if we wanted to be taught as a group or individually. And Anne and Michelle Martin, who's another Tibetan translator, said individually. And I was the first person to be taught. And we could tell just by how he was speaking to me that his presence and his perception was quite great. And this went on for 2 days, 3 days, as we stayed and camped out at Samye Chimpuk. And then at the end, when we were making our offerings and leaving, he said to me, I will see you again. And I thought it was a kind phrase. And so I said, okay, see you again. And he said, no, I am really going to see you again. So that part of the story many people know. Azam Rinpoche is the person that in 2003 made an announcement, unbeknownst to me, that I would be teaching the practices which are known as Nundro. And he made the announcement at a large Zen center we had rented for him. And I was very surprised. He said that I would be teaching these methods. And they're the methods of refuge, they're the methods of purification, they're the methods that connect to the lineage of Longchen Robjam, Jigme Lingpa, Yeshe Sogyal, and Padmasambhava. In more recent time, he calls me Lama Jacqueline, which I thought was said as endearing, and now publicly. The whole journey from being born in the rural South to being raised in Ohio as a cheerleader, as someone who went to Ohio State and then Boston University, and then taught school, and then aspired to travel to learn experientially, and that wanting to learn experientially came to the inner experience and came into Buddhism and came into the Bodhi tree and came in contact with the Buddha's enlightenment. And my mind is totally extraordinary. And I think if it's something that I could do as growing up in a very conventional way, that it is absolutely something we all can do. So I thank you for joining.